Good day, Riverside voters. We are here today with another forum, mini forum, with one of our candidates running for City Council. We're here with Christen Montero from Ward 2. Christen, welcome.
Thank you, Liz.
Of course, any of you that have seen our other forums where we had all the candidates, you can find them on our website. The website will be on the screen for you, where you can go in and review all those previous forums where we interviewed all the candidates at once. These are individual interviews. The candidates all received 2 questions beforehand that they're going to be able to answer, and then we have 1 third question or so to talk about afterwards. It's going to be a discussion type of forum. So, Christen, let's start in with the first question. City residents often distrust the government. Please share a time when you rebuilt trust after a mistake or controversy. What did you do differently going forward, and how did you measure improvement?
Yes, thank you, Liz. So trust is something that's not given, but is earned. And definitely that's earned through consistently showing up, right? As an entrepreneur, in my experience, we had a situation where a lack of information, we had a project timeline change, and we didn't communicate that well enough to our stakeholders. That led to unfortunately a distrust because of that lack of information. And when those project times shifted, we could have communicated that a lot sooner so that our stakeholders understood what was going to be changed. One of the first things that I realized was that in the absence of information, it creates a vacuum gap. And a lot of times, once that vacuum gap happens, it really causes a huge uproar. A lot of people start going to the worst case scenario, right? So one of the things I did was first host an open meeting, creating just for staff and stakeholders to actually sit in and share their thoughts, concerns, what they thought could have done better, because it does take a collective whole to really improve on things. Secondly, what I did was actually create a real-time dashboard. So letting people know that we are making an effort to not only take steps to change, but measure those changes, and showing that transparently to be able to communicate to folks that didn't know some of that information, to be able to have that in a very transparent, real-time way. That way they could see some of the progress, some of the hurdles even that we ran into in that project. At the same time, going forward, I also moved into a more proactive response to understanding project timelines and how we can really move forward in a non-reactive model, right? So many times when it comes to mistakes, we're always reacting. But if we're always reacting, how can we then actually be proactive in the things that need to be changed, or proactive in just things that we're doing moving forward to avoid mishaps, right? Versus constantly making those same mistakes. In City Hall, I will definitely apply those same type of, leadership, where open door policy is something that's so important, that transparency, that accountability. A lot of times there's process when it comes to city government, and residents are usually the last ones to hear when something falls through, when things aren't going the way that we planned. And I'm here to ensure that being on city council, that's something where residents are not going to be the last to hear about it. And some of that is reflective in the current process that exists right now, where unfortunately something like public comments is something that happens almost to the end, where we're hearing open opinion, but the true impact to be able to give back into the community and affect policy and affect some of the things that are being decided on the dais aren't really tangible. It's just almost an open discussion, but not so much something where we can take that critique and feedback and actually change and improve on what we're doing. So I do believe in continuous improvement and having that open door policy.
So this kind of brings up the question of community engagement, which is, and the city now has kind of been practicing for the last few years what some people would call a community disengagement.
Yeah.
To where the public comment periods have kind of been watered down and restricted more, and there's no dialogue back and forth. If you go to the county supervisors meetings or the water board meetings, and you see somebody comes up and speaks, if they have questions for them, they ask them questions, they get into a discussion, right?
Right.
They wanna know what's going on. Our city council's kind of taken on the tack that, no, we don't respond to anyone that comes up unless they're giving a presentation, formal presentation. We just thank them for their comment and they step down. So people get very disenfranchised to, did anyone even pay attention?
Yes.
We've even had people stand up there and say, well, I know you're all gonna look at your cell phones while I'm talking, you know, so what kind of changes do you think you'd like to see in the way the city council operates?
Yeah, so some of that is laid out in our city charter. We're one of the few cities that have a charter where we, as the people, decide on how those meetings are ran. There's a difference between having a presentation, from what I've understood, and having something that's for open discussion where it's more of a workshop, right? It's in the terminology. Unfortunately, right now, the process is if it's something that's to be presented, it's just comment and it's not a discussion. If it's a workshop, that's where now there's discussion. There's more of a debate, more of being able to answer questions. So we do have an opportunity that's coming up because our city charter does get revamped ever so often, and that's something that's going to be happening in 2028. However, don't wait till 2028 because that's not when the changes are being proposed. It's now.
Right.
And we're in 2026. So that board is actually going to be formed I believe at the end of this summer. And that is the opportunity to not only as residents know who's going to be on the board or going to be appointed onto that board, but once those appointments happen, go to those people directly. Share what you want to be changed. For example, when it comes to public commentary and how certain items are put on an agenda for consent versus presentation versus a workshop discussion type, platform, it's definitely, that is an opportunity to instill the change that needs to happen because we are governed by our city charter.
Yeah. Okay, great. Let's get into our next question. When revenues came in lower than expected in an organization you worked with, how did you respond? Walk us through the specific steps you took to realign spending with available resources.
Yes, so being in the private sector, budget shortfalls aren't just an inconvenience. It's an opportunity to be innovative, right? A lot of times people will go to cutting budgets means cutting staff and an across the board cut. In my experience, when we've fallen short of having revenue, I always lean towards innovation, thinking outside the box, finding ways where we can preserve what we are working on and preserve what matters most, right? So I like to take a lean type approach to first understanding and auditing some of the core services of our organization that we had. And when I did that audit, it was not just looking at the core services, but measuring and deciding on what was actually being impactful, what was being relied on. From there, not just auditing, but also looking at the structural efficiencies, right? So when it comes to process and understanding, okay, sometimes we have workflows that cause waste. Sometimes we have bureaucratic workflows that cause waste in resources. When it comes to things like that, especially there's also looking at redundant software. Maybe there's underutilized spaces. In our case, there was definitely inefficient workflows was a huge contributor, and looking at the structural efficiency of that process and the different processes of how we got there. At the same time, not just auditing, but we shifted to a more performance-based budget. So it was looking at, okay, if these are the core services that have the best impact and are the things that make our organization run, what can we do to preserve that at all costs? It's not cutting staff because that comes at the cost, we need the staff to be able to operate. So then it was looking at, okay, well, what can we trim, what fat can we trim without losing those core essential needs of the organization? I think the same thing is reflective in city government, right? So many times we have essential services, and with inflation and increase in demand of resources, there's always a lack of budget or a need to cut budget because there isn't enough money to go around.
Right.
The biggest thing is fiscal responsibility, right? Understanding that it's the people that make up what is even being done and having that impact. At the same time, it's also looking at, okay, well, fiscal responsibility doesn't mean being stingy. It means being efficient and also finding ways outside of the box to serve the community and our residents. And that's how I believe City Council should continue to serve.
Right. Very good. So one of the top things coming up in the ballot is Measure Z.
Yes.
Tax increase, an extension on the deadline of 2036 for infinity, basically going out as far as it goes. What's your opinion on that Measure Z?
So let's back up a bit. So with Measure Z, I know it's a huge controversy. Right now, I pay taxes as a business owner, as a resident, and I've paid taxes as long as I've lived here, over 30 years. When it comes to Measure Z, there is the way of the use of funds of Measure Z in the past, and then there's also what is needing to be funded currently and why. So right now with Measure Z, there's been a huge push and understanding that there's a need for increasing Measure Z because we need firefighter infrastructure. There's been so much growth in the city, but with every apartment that goes up means more phone calls, more emergencies happening, and firefighters are the first response. But we don't really have a firefighter budget, right?
It's a general fund tax.
Correct. So this is where I think of being lean. Right now, it is what it is when it comes to how the government is operating. But I know that being a city council member and being put in that position, if I were to be into city council, the first thing I would advocate is not just having this general budget, but actually having a focused budget on some of the core services that our residents depend on. At the same time, no one likes their taxes being increased. I know I don't, and a lot of people don't either, because we work so hard for our money, and then to see 40% of our income go to taxes sometimes can be discouraging, especially when we're working 2 or 3 jobs. When it comes to, unfortunately, the need of the budget, there is a need to somehow increase the money. Moving forward, I believe that finding new ways of revenue and innovative ways of thinking outside of the box is needed, and not just looking at increasing Measure Z infinitely forever and depending on it. Because we all know that our hard work and earned money shouldn't just go to something that's generally used and doesn't have any transparency in what it's actually being used for. And a lot of times right now, there's a lot of folks that have came to me and said, well, it sounds great why we need to increase Measure Z, but the truth is that some of those funds aren't really being utilized for what it was initially advocated for, right?
It's a general fund tax. If it was a special tax, then it would be audited separately and the funds would be earmarked.
Right.
And that's the argument that some people have of why didn't you make it a special tax? I don't think anybody would have not voted for it if you just said it was a special tax. It's going for firefighters and other emergency services. It's going to be accounted for in a separate fund.
Right.
And money will be only spent for that.
Right.
So that you don't get a new city council in 2 or
Right.
3 years that goes, well, I can't speak for what they did. I can only speak for what we're going to do. And
Right.
we're going to spend the money this way.
Right. And that's interesting, is because as I've learned, every time there's a new city council, the effort of that prior city council, even if they created processes to serve their residents, doesn't get handed down.
No.
The council are starting from scratch. Even myself, when I've reached out to pass certain city council, that's how I learned that it's not by choice, it's by process of having to turn in, wipe computers, wipe everything, and the legacy of what somebody has put in for 10 to 15 years, all that wisdom just goes away. I think it's great that Clarissa has a dashboard that's real time to see the public safety issues, which really helps with the transparency and accountability in the city council. I, as you know, hope to move forward in her seat, would like to continue that, not let that be something that only existed for that term, because that's part of the problem. We want to grow, but if everyone's serving their own agenda and not the needs of the residents, and especially when the time it took to even create that process or that dashboard didn't come from everyone's volunteered time, it came from your taxes. Right? And it's understanding that how that trickle down affects in so many different ways how things get done in city council today.
Right.
So I definitely, unfortunately, with Measure Z, there is a need for increase in taxes to a degree. But how we hold city council accountable to how those funds are used and the transparency of how those funds have been used in the past is key to actually driving change in our community, right? It's not continuing that same way of thinking, that same way of process. We need to do something new and have a different perspective.
That's the key to getting the public to back it, right?
Right.
There's been too much, well, we had the money in there for that, we spent a little bit on it in the beginning, and now we've been spending it on all kinds of other stuff, and there's tons of examples of stuff where the money got spent and got put in the general fund. When it's in the general fund, it's general.
Right, it's not like as residents, you then get to decide, oh no, okay, well, we'll approve, you know, this 15 million going to this, even though originally it was supposed to go to this.
And then stretching it forever instead of the 2036 deadline means the public now has to go out and get an initiative, get signatures for a ballot measure, and do all, so now you put the heavy burden back on the public that hasn't had a good say in the beginning.
Right, and there is, budget commissions and certain commissions that look over that, and those are advisory roles though, right? City council doesn't have to listen to everything that is advised either.
Well, and there's been complaints from a number of the chairs of those commissions that they don't even have control over their own agendas.
Yes.
That the city staff controls the agendas, and so they don't get to talk about what they want to talk about.
Yes, that is true, definitely to a degree. And then I would say the city staff does work with the chairman of that commission. So then it relies on one person to be willing to step outside the box and step up. And if that one person that sits in the chair is somebody who is in the pockets of other people or has a different agenda, that's not going to happen, even if the rest of their board wants something different.
Well, folks, you've heard from Christen today. Thank you for watching. Please tune in for other videos for other candidates. We wish you well in your campaign.
Thank you.
And all the best.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's time for a new voice for Riverside and somebody who will definitely advocate for the residents, and being a local resident of Ward 2, growing up, going to Taft Elementary, Amelia Earhart, King, I think it's more important now than ever to have somebody on the dais that actually comes from the community and isn't a political, career-seeking individual or title-seeking. I definitely do this for the heart of the community and hope that I can bring change and not just drive ideas, but drive results. So thank you, Louis.
Well, there you have it, folks. Have a good day, and everyone get out and vote in June, or you can't complain about anything.
June 2nd. See you there.